Omar Suleiman is Syria's most famous rap artist. He lives in a refugee camp. Today on Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Shayna Silverstein and I examine dance, music, culture, the Arab Spring, and civil war in Syria. Welcome to Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Shayna Silverstein. Dr. Silverstein teaches at Northwestern University. She has a Ph.D. in Ethnomusicology from the University of Chicago.
Right.
Could we start with that? What is ethnomusicology? Please explain.
Absolutely. It's a tricky word to pull off, but once you get deep inside of it, it's a very, very rich field. So basically what we're interested in as ethnomusicologists is the social study of music and oftentimes dance. And so we're interested in how music and dance are a way to become more familiar with certain cultures, to look at the way that globalization has affected societies worldwide, particularly through the flow of music and often dance.
Okay, very good. Now, you write a lot about dance in Syria. What's your connection with Syria?
My connection is that I was a recent graduate from college in 2001.
Sure.
And I was living and working in New York City. And that's when the Twin Towers fell. At that time, I was working for an arts administration organization, the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. And we lost one of our artists in that tragedy. And so it was a moment of real reflection and reckoning. Yeah. And one of my first responses that very day, for all of us.
Especially if you knew somebody was there.
Yeah, and in New York, New York already has this tendency to be the epicenter of the world, But
it's a good thing, it's a bad thing sometimes.
Yeah. And so I had two kind of reactions. The very first one was to go to a local Arab community organization in Brooklyn and volunteer. I feared a backlash, anti-Arab discrimination that might occur.
Sure.
The second was to kind of ask the big question of what does this mean for U.S. Middle East relations? This didn't come out of a vacuum. And so as I decided to become a scholar and work on research, I said, well, I'd like to work in the Middle East in order to better understand the societies and culture and history that led to this particular moment. And so that was the gateway. And from there, as I became more familiar with the Middle East through travel, through meeting artists, musicians, dancers, educators, students, it took on a real life of its own.
Well, and then a second event happened, which must have been really significant for you, and that is the Arab Spring. Can you talk a little bit about how that, what happened in Syria and how that plays out in terms of dance and culture?
Many important questions. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't mean to ask them all at once, but pick one and start, and we'll move on. Yes.
Yeah, so before we, kind of get to March 2011, which is when, if you will, the Arab Spring began in Syria, thanks to a couple of school-age boys in a small town of Dara. Before that, there was Egypt, and I think without Tahrir Square, there would not have been the uprising in Syria. And so as a researcher, I have to say very comfortably ensconced at my office here in Chicago, so I was far away from all of the turmoil. I was absolutely shocked and relieved and so excited by January 25th and Tahrir Square and what was happening in Cairo. This just seemed like such a complete seismic shift in everything that could become possible. And I know I'm speaking grandiose terms, but that's kind of the emotion and psyche that was happening at that time. And a lot of us then became completely glued to Twitter and,
It seemed like the fall of the Berlin Wall all over again, right? I mean, we all celebrated.
Yeah, exactly. But even on January 25th, I did not anticipate that it would trigger protests in Syria. I had spent from 2004 till the end of 2008 going back and forth between the United States and Syria. At one point, living there for about a year and a half. in addition to the smaller trips. And while I found it to be an extremely open, extremely hospitable, warm, receiving society that really welcomed my research project and the questions that I asked of people, and often was welcomed into their homes, the level of repression that continuously occurred, and the lack of due process of law and whatnot that I had become familiar with by living there was such that I did not think that there were cracks in the regime, or that people would be able to break through with the barriers of fear that in fact they did break through.
Yeah.
So when March happened, that was a very, very, very exhilarating moment.
Gave you a very unique perspective because you were there looking at the culture and studying it before the cracks, right? So walk us through that. What did you
absolutely.
see?
So as an ethnomusicologist, I'm always interested in relationships between tradition and modernity, and so I became very intrigued by debka, which is the Syrian folk dance. Now, this is a line dance where people clasp hands and move around in an open-ended circle and accompanied by drums and instruments such as the mizmar, which is a flute, and the rabab, which is a spiked fiddle in the traditional sense. And so
vernacular, this is what we call a ring dance or something. It's
you call it line dance.
Somewhat similar to what Greeks and
very similar to Bulgarians, to the Turkish folk dance, most commonly known throughout Palestine and Lebanon and Jordan, as well in Syria, as debka. So all of that entire region, which is sometimes called al-Mashriq, share this line dance. It's performed at weddings, baptisms, all sorts of things. So
I saw one the other day.
Yeah. Oh, you did? Okay, great.
Not your kind, but I saw it.
But it's also what people are motivated to start up, start up a debki session when they gather together. And that feeling of collectivity is often a very, it gives a sort of power for collective assembly that when, as of March 2011, when Syrians started to organize protests in small towns and villages across the country, they also started to practice debka at the protests.
Really?
And so you have these Fridays, days of protest that were organized over social media, in very kind of flashpoint ways, so that so you couldn't really trace when or where it was going to happen, because they always had to keep a couple steps ahead of security forces. And then debka would occur, and sometimes it'd be a heavily choreographed dance and music session. So, for instance, 4 dancers might be dressed in green and white and black, which are the colors of the pre-Ba'athist Syria flag. So the regime governs and organizes the Ba'ath Party, right? And so by taking up the colors of the flag of Syria before the Ba'ath Party came to power, the protesters are reclaiming their political space. Right. So they wear that garb, and then dance the debka as a way to say, here's our collective identity in the face of the regime. And then that also is kind of captures the spirit of the protests as well, because they were channeling joy, if you will. The affect of the protest was something that was actually very celebratory, even in the face of certain violence. Every time there's a protest, it was a matter of time before the security forces would come in, either beat people, detain people, shoot at the protesters, So the marking of the end of a protest event would certainly be violence by the state. Yeah. So it's this interesting sort of dance, if you will.
It's it's part of a long history of peaceful protests, I guess. We think of Gandhi in India and the civil rights movement under Martin Luther King in the United States, a series of protests since then, but this idea of dancing to express yourself in the face of troops coming at you, it's very different. I don't know that I saw a lot of that in the news. Did this get coverage in America? Or?
Unfortunately, not so much. Yeah. Protests were covered. There were so many happening, which is something in itself to really support. But the dancing itself got a little bit buried by. But part of it, I think, is for good reason, because some of what the coverage captured was the satirical tone of many of the protesters. And so there's a town named Kafranbel, and they kind of became a flashpoint for writing these really witty, very humorous, very ironic, satirical remarks that were specifically addressed to the global community that they knew were training their gaze upon Syria.
Yeah.
You know, so.
And they were, how were they getting these comments out? They were.
So that was the role of
written
citizen.
on walls, they were.
Yeah, no, they would,
Yeah.
write out banners, marker and paper.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, and citizen journalism was the way that all of this footage was able to get from Syria out to either immediately beyond Syria's borders, such as Jordan and Lebanon, or to the United States and Europe.
Well, just to stick with dance for a second. There's dancing that we do to rock music and things like that. It seems to me that's, I'd like to hear what you think about this, but it seems to me that's very individualistic. You're performing to some idea in your head of what you think you look like, and you probably look pretty silly, right? But you like what you're doing, right? So you go ahead and you dance. It's
I have
personal
a
expression.
good story
right?
from the field about that. But
So your wedding reception, and you do several dances like that, and then all of a sudden the circle forms in the middle of the room, right? And it's almost more than just a dance, right? It's a matter of you being part of this group and wanting to be part of the group, and the group wanting you to be part of it. Because every time I see that happening, they're pulling people in. Somebody's saying, I don't want to do this, and they drag them in, right? So what's the nature of that dance that pulls people in, and how does that does that facilitate the protest movement to some extent?
Yeah. So it's very much a community-oriented dance.
Yeah.
It's mixed gender, men and women both participate, and it's tactile. You literally clasp hands, and it's especially important that you keep the rhythm with the dancers around you. And in fact, when the leader at the head of the line, which is a very important kind of prominent position, and you basically have to be quite competent and quite good to take up that position. They also depend upon.
So if you don't know what you're doing, you should go to the end of the line.
Yeah,
right?
most definitely. So that's where you could find me. They depend upon the dancers next to them to keep the rhythm. So it's in this way a very interconnected kind of dance, where it's not about the individual, as you just pointed out.
Yeah, I wonder if it gives people a sense of safety.
Yeah, I don't know about safety, but it certainly gives a sense that that whatever actions you take depend upon the actions of everybody else. So that you can't possibly become that kind of virtuosic, leader without having a strong core behind you. And when in my scholarship, I look at how that particularly relates to gendered relations, and in the case of Syria, although this is different in different national contexts, but in the case of Syria, most often that person is male, and so I look at this as a performance of masculinity, but in contrast to, say, Western forms of masculinity, it's kind of masculinity that is very much connected to every other body in that space who is performing.
So, I know you've written about negotiating gender and morality through Syrian dance, right? So, let's learn a little bit more about that.
Sure.
How does that work? Negotiating gender. Why do you say negotiating?
Well, I say negotiating gender because I see gender, I'm now in a department of performance studies, and so we see the ways that we use our bodies, whether it's through nonverbal gestures, such as what I'm doing with my hands now, or dancing, or through the words that we say, as doing things in and of themselves. Right, and so I see our maleness and our femaleness, those aspects of gender, as something that we are constantly reiterating and saying again and again through the words and actions that we take. And so I'm interested in the way that this codified dance and music tradition that's so central to how communities constitute themselves, such as at weddings. That this is also a place where communities constituted through those gendered relations. So that whenever the Ibn al-Balad, which means son of the village or son of the country, is up there doing that beautiful solo dance, at the front of the Debki line at his cousin's wedding, that's a way of kind of building in a pride of that village, a pride of that community, but it's done specifically actually through that performance of maleness or masculinity, and kind of then reinforces a patriarchal.
The Arab Spring happens. This gets picked up in Syria. There's a strong reaction from the government. Where did this go? Did people continue to dance and protest? And what's going on now?
Yeah, so Unfortunately, would that it were the case. From March 2011 until basically December of 2011, some say, that was really the heart of the creative, nonviolent, peaceful protests. And there was so much exciting cultural production that occurred. It was the protests and the banners and the performances at the protests. It was also on social media. So YouTube and Facebook became unbanned by the regime, so they now became accessible, and so people began creating web series or short clips that were uploaded and then spread virally, and all of this in the name of creative non-violent protest. And for instance, there's a wonderful puppet show that kind of takes on satirically the regime called Massaset Mati, and in one interview they say our inspiration is the Debka. This stands for how we think of the Syrian people and all of its potential. But after that, the regime really began to crack down, and people then began to take up arms in response to that crackdown. And so by 2012, it started to become more of a civil war, if you will. And then, as we know, it then became invested in by outside external factors. So it's now more of a proxy war. Then there was the rise of ISIS and so on.
Well, but
much to talk about there.
So is there, are there people in Syria who are still going about their daily lives and they listen to music, or is everyone in hiding? And what's what's life like there right now?
It's a challenging question. I think.
I mean, do you have insights to that? Are you in touch with people?
I am. To be honest, most of the people that I'm in contact with have left. And they've resettled in.
It's interesting. There's a bit of a similarity there. I think of the anti-war protests in the '60s. There was a period of a couple of years there where pretty much all of the protest was happening through music, through lyrics, right, of songs, folk songs, and then eventually rock songs.
Exactly.
So it was, an art-related protest movement of a kind. Of course, it was in a relatively safer environment. We had Kent State and a few other incidents, but nothing compared to what Syria is going through. Yet there is a punk Arab singer, isn't there?
Yes, the infamous Omar Suleiman.
Suleiman, yes. Tell me about him.
Yeah, so Omar Suleiman, he's a very interesting character and a phenomenal singer who's really achieved a level of success and recognition in Europe and North America, unlike any other Syrian performer that has come before him. He's kind of crossed over into audiences who love punk music, right, and who love to go to rave festivals. So who is he? What is he about? He's from kind of what we call like a border zone region of Syria, which is actually really interesting because it's a melange of different cultural influences. So his music is actually a little bit Syrian and a whole lot Kurdish, a little bit Iraqi. He likes he before he became a Western phenomenon, he was playing for audiences in the Gulf, so he kind of acquired some of the Gulf dialect, Khaliji, to be able to speak to those audiences.
So this is one of those cities like Trieste or Thessalonica in Greece that's really not just representative of its country. It's kind of a stepping off point to Muscat, I think, is like that, right? To other areas.
Yeah, exactly.
So he reflects that.
But he was a wedding singer. First he was working in construction, and then he had an injury to his eye, and he just was performing for local weddings. Which is very much like a working class. I know, right? Well, you should see some of his videos. They're
they're bad. Okay.
They've got this sort of ad hoc, juxtaposed, non-narrative quality. But he was a local wedding singer, and then he worked with a Kurdish keyboardist, Razan Saeed, who really gave a lot of frenzied energy, which people apparently in the West really love, and make comparisons to Jamaican dance hall and house music and techno. It's really interesting how he kind of gets translated, his music gets translated over. And then a fellow from the Bay Area,
Of course.
Mark Gurgis, who happens to have some Middle Eastern background, but is very much a punk, self-described punk.
It's just a matter of time till Bob Dylan gets in
Yeah,
on this.
yeah. So he was wandering around
it.
Damascus. Now he didn't speak Arabic, but he's wandering around looking at different CDs, and he picks up some local, CDs for $1 and brings them back, and it sits in his basement for years. And then somebody asks him something, I don't know, and he goes and he looks at him, he's like, actually there's a lot here. And he worked for a record label named Sublime Frequencies, and they got going a bunch of releases by Omar Suleiman through Sublime Frequencies. And then things took off, and about 2007, 2009, and they invited Omar, so they're kind of being cultural brokers, Sublime Frequencies being cultural brokers for Omar Suleiman, invited him to tour some European festivals, and the rest is history. He's worked for Bjork, Kronos Quartet has arranged his music,
So, and where does he live now?
He lives in a refugee camp
He
in
does,
Turkey.
really? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
No kidding. And he's got to be worth a lot of money at this point.
Yeah, he is, money comes and money goes when you need an entertainer.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, I'm sure it does. On another topic here, what kind of influence do you see in the United States from the Syrian culture and Syrian music?
Right, yeah. I think that most of the awareness comes through charity work.
Really?
I see local communities, especially those here in Chicago, but also, for instance, in Canada, who are coming together in order to sponsor a Syrian family who is arriving to, for instance, O'Hare O'Hare Airport, and they want to have an apartment ready down to the most endearing, intimate detail, a teddy bear propped up in the crib, and so truly saying you are welcome here. We hope that we can help you to build a new life.
That's great.
And so, and so in a way, I think one of the benefits from refugees remaking their lives here is that they're helping local communities here become stronger and more
and before
cohesive.
these troubled times, there was some Syrian immigration, right?
Oh yeah, there's been Syrian immigration since the late 19th century, early 20th century.
Yeah.
Most of those waves of integration were Christian Arabs. And so the fact that the majority of Syrian refugees today are Muslim is a significant difference.
Yeah. So what hopes do you have for Syria and for cultural diversity? What are your expectations? What are your
Right. Yeah.
whatever.
You mean within the country?
Well, I mean, do you think it's possible this is going to end in some kind of way where there'll be some kind of reconciliation here and we'll work things out and this war is going to stop in the near future and people will go back to living normal lives again? Or do you see this?
I think it'll take a couple of generations.
Yeah.
A number of people that I'm in touch with have no interest in returning to Syria, and they have many opportunities available to them outside of Syria that they want to pursue. But the generation that comes after them may seek a sense of return, and that the healing will take at least a couple of generations because the kind of violence and rupture that has occurred to date is really rather intractable. I think most Syrians they retain hope, and that's one of the things that has carried through from 2011 to today. Is there's still so much hope.
Yeah.
But everybody is very aware that hope is not realizable in the near future. So with hope comes that with a patience and needing to survive,
Yeah. Well, mostly what you get from watching TV is just a fear that it's going to keep escalating, right? It's really been unfortunate to have to watch that. So what kind of context do you have over there now?
Most people are based in cities outside of Syria. So people in Beirut and most of the artists and musicians and dancers that I'm in touch with, they're actively creating new projects. They're seeking funding from institutions where they are based, whether that be Amsterdam or Berlin.
Yeah. So sort of an intellectual flight out of the artistic intellectual flight.
Yeah. And also thinking very critically and creatively about what to make of that flight.
Yeah. I suppose it's a little easier to get out if you have some talent. Does that contribute to that somehow, or?
Yeah, that's something, that's a big question that I'm actually asking right now in current research.
Yeah.
You know, particularly in Europe and particularly in Germany, and even more so Berlin, which is generally known as a cultural hub for Europe, but it's now where a lot of Syrian artists have begun to make their home. So it's now a cultural hub for Syrians, displaced Syrian artists. You know, there's the question of who is the deserving refugee and who is not deserving.
Yeah.
You know, so is the artist a deserving refugee, somebody who has skills and potential and can contribute in a very valuable way to society, and therefore is deemed to be somebody to give all that sort of promise to
really
and
selfish
invest in, or
of it,
versus you know, the person who is formerly a farmer, just trying to, you know, live a safe life.
Yeah,
but might be considered less deserving under refugee
to
justice
prefer
scores.
the people who can come and entertain us, right? And things like that.
Yeah.
Well, it was very informative. Thank you. That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Shayna Silverstein for joining us on Roundtable Perspective today. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.